So what are some of the things that you know about these lost civilizations? Tell me what you know. What was outstanding about them? First of all, it says that the statues and the artifacts were unlike any they'd seen before. That probably means they were more advanced, more sophisticated than what they were used to finding at that level. What are some other things you know? Yes?
They had, like, a well-organized government.
They had a well-organized government. And how could they tell that? How could they tell that that community was organized, that someone was in charge? Give me some ways that showed. Yes?
Like things were all planned out and everything.
Yes. Incredibly well-planned cities, laid out in a perfect grid, 90-degree angles for every street. That doesn't happen by accident, right? They had uniform bricks. So there were rules about how to do things. Their bricks were always the same size. Their streets were laid out really neatly. What else was outstanding about this culture that you learned?
Their plumbing and water works.
Plumbing. To have plumbing at this stage in history is definitely impressive. And not only plumbing to bring water in, but underground sewers. Now, can you imagine living in a place that doesn't have underground sewers? Do you remember what I told you about what was happening in Europe as far as sewage was concerned at this time? What was happening? Who could tell me?
Throw it out the window.
Yeah, they'd throw it out the window. They'd have their little honey pots in their room at night, and they'd use it, and then they'd go to the window and they'd say, "Gardez-vous," that means watch out below for what's coming. And they'd just throw their sewage on the street. Now, can you imagine what those cities smelled like?
Yeah.
So gross, right? So plumbing shows that they were very concerned about neatness, cleanliness, and organization.
How can you have plumbing back then without modern day systems?
I know. Well, they did it. They had underground sewage drains. It was really impressive. And then they had a uniform weights and measures. Every time they found, a scale or something for measuring, all the weights were uniform, so you couldn't cheat someone. So this was a definitely organized group of people. What happened to this group of people? Who can tell me what happened? Yes?
They think that the, Aryans, is that how you say it? Aryans came and overtook.
Oh, they could have been overthrown by another culture. What do we know about the culture that followed after them?
They were primitive.
They were much more primitive. Everything went backwards. The works, like the statues and the art and everything, became more primitive. The pottery became more primitive. What are some other theories when a society like that disappears about what could have happened? Invasion is one. What's another one?
They could have gotten sick and all been wiped out.
Okay, there could have been a plague. What else can you imagine might happen? Pardon?
Famine, maybe?
A famine from not having crops in a certain year.
Or a natural disaster.
A flood, some natural disaster, much more likely to wipe out everyone, would be like a flood or an earthquake or a volcano eruption, that sort of thing. And this one, like she said, the Aryans might have invaded and taken over. They were mostly farmers, but do we think that these communities traded with anyone?
Yeah.
Like a uniform
They use
system
this.
of weights.
Yeah.
Yes.
Merchants.
Some people were merchants and traders, and their ships carried cargo of cotton cloth, grain, copper, pearls, and ivory combs to distant lands, and they know that because they found products made there in distant lands, and some of them even reached as far as Sumer. What was their religion? Monotheistic or polytheistic? Everybody. Polytheistic, that's right. What does that mean when I say polytheistic? What does that mean, Perla?
Belief in many gods.
Belief in many gods. And monotheistic is what, Jane? Belief in one God, that's right. So they had a polytheistic religion. Now, one thing that studying history has showed me over time is that if a society has a mother goddess, they tend to be more generous to women and what they let women do in their culture than if they have a warrior god. They tend to have less subjugation of the women. We don't have evidence of that, but we know they had a mother goddess, so that bodes well for the women in that society. Indus people worship sacred animals, including the bull. The bull in the artwork and stuff showed that the bull was sacred. Now, is that common still in India, that a bull is sacred?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It is. Bulls can come into some people's house if they get through the door by mistake and start thrashing everything, and they won't hurt it. They'll just let it be. I'd have my broom, get out of my house. But they believe that's a sacred animal. Okay, so who can tell me about the notorious Mortimer Wheeler? Who can tell me something about him? Who was he anyway? How does he fit into this story? Yes, Maddie.
He found the Indus Valley Civilization,
Oh.
he was one of the persons.
Okay, he was one of the archaeologists who helped undig this place. Then what did he do? Yes, Joy.
He like tried to get people to come and pay to get there.
Okay, he opened it up like Disneyland, right? Admission, come see these marvels and these wonders. And what did that do as far as archaeology is concerned? Riley, what did that do?
Well, it could have destroyed a lot of things with people just stepping all over.
Yes, it could have compromised the site if you let too many people in. The Lascaux cave paintings are closed off to the public because the moisture that people were bringing in there was destroying them. So they've made an airtight seal with controlled air, and they did a virtual tour. They went through with cameras. So if you want to see the Lascaux cave paintings, you can see them right here in America as well as I could see them if I was in France. So that it compromises contact. What else did his sensationalizing of this archaeological find, what else did that do to the public? Yes.
It brought thousands of visitors.
It brought thousands of visitors and anything else?
It was their fascination with archaeologists and their findings and stuff.
Okay, great. It created a fascination with archaeology. It wasn't till after this time that younger people started saying more often that they'd want to be archaeologists. He made archaeology into something exciting. He was a salesman. Doesn't he look like a salesman in this picture? He just cracks me up. I expect him to go like this and twist his mustache. See how it's curled up there on the end? And he had a reputation of being a little bit of a scoundrel, not always honest about things. And he knew how to manipulate the press brilliantly, so he could build this up, promote it in the press, and get people to come. But in a way, it was a blessing for archaeology because it piqued a lot of people's interest in archaeology. And then we've already discussed the theories of why this civilization might have disappeared. One of them is damage to the local environment, but I don't see exactly what they mean there. Usually that happens in forested areas where people use up all the trees and don't replant any, and then they have to move. But in their terrain, I don't know what that would have been. Here it says possibly too many trees were cut down to fuel the ovens of the brick makers. So yes, they could have used up the wood. Another interesting thing was they found tons of river mud in the streets. So your idea, or the idea that Izzy brought up about a flood, was a good one. And then it talks about an earthquake and the invasion of the Aryans. All those are possibilities. But I love this whole thing about lost cultures. We're going to see another one with the Minoans when we get to Greece. How exciting it is to discover those things. To me, another really exciting find that we're going to study about of a culture that nobody believed in was the Trojans. Everybody thought Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were just made-up stories about some war that didn't happen. But then Heinrich Schliemann came along and he dug up Troy and all the evidence that Troy existed and the evidence that they had that huge battle. And now we know that the basis for the Odyssey and the Iliad really was the Trojan War. I mean, I'm sure he sensationalized. In fact, we know because he does fantastical things in his story. But it was really exciting to me to find out that the Trojan War really happened. So archaeologists can find a lot of things with their digging that are interesting. Now, in this other section that you studied, we talked about the Aryans. They were a warlike people, but as soon as they conquered somewhere, they would settle down and farm. They valued stealing and looting, which I thought was really interesting. Who can tell me the 3 levels of their hierarchy as far as people's importance? What was number 1, Maddie?
Wait, never mind.
Okay, who knows number 1? Yes.
Are you talking about the 3 basic groups of the people?
I'm talking about in the Aryan society, how
Yeah.
their people were divided by occupation. Okay, what's the first level then, Rachel?
The Brahmins,
The Brahmins. What's the second, Joy?
the Kshatriyas,
Kshatriyas, very good. And the third one?
Vaishya. I don't know. I had to say
Okay,
that.
it's a long I, so that's Vais.
Oh,
Vaisyas. Okay, and then they had the lower class of herders, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The priests gained the most respect in the Aryan society, and they have a very old book. We don't know who started it, we don't know how old it is. It's probably, I don't know, I think it's definitely one of the very oldest religious books in existence, and that is what? What do they call that old book? Pardon?
Is it the Vedas? Vedas or?
Yes, the Vedas. Okay, so that is a very old book and has some of their stories and it helps us to learn about their religion. They had been nomads, but after they conquered good farming land, they settled down and they actually left us some great literature, wonderful poems. One of them is Ramayana. That's one that I know and have read in a translation, of course, which was very insightful to their society. They valued romance and they valued beautiful women and they valued daring on the part of their men to fight for women. The Mahabharata is another one that I haven't read, but it's got nearly 100,000 verses. And this talks about their values in fighting and battles and conquering. So it gave us insight. All right, you're next going to go to China. That was India, and that was just a quick review of what we learned about ancient India. The highlight being, of course, the Twin Cities. Now, I think I said this to you before, but can you imagine being an archaeologist and realizing you just discovered this amazing lost civilization? I think you would have just goosebumps. And then when you made the discovery that they had plumbing and you kept digging and you saw how the cities were laid out, it would be so exciting. I'm not an archaeologist. I've never really thought about being an archaeologist, but I can relate to what a thrill that must be for someone who does that for a living. And that's how we find out about so much of these old civilizations. As we go to China, I need someone to read Setting the Scene for China. Someone with a nice loud voice, please. Okay, volunteer, nice and loud, please.
In very ancient times, relates a Chinese legend, floodwaters rose to the top of the highest hills. You, a hard-working official, labored for 13 years to drain the waters. I opened passages for the streams throughout the Nine province and conducted them to the sea. I depended channels and canals and conducted them to the streams. Shujing, Book of History. While taming the river, Yu did not once go home to see his wife and children. As a reward for his selfless effort, he later became the ruler of China. The legend of Yu offers insights into early China. The ancient Chinese valued the ability to control floodwater and to develop irrigation systems for farming. The legend also shows how highly the Chinese prized devotion to duty. Both of these values played a key role in the development of Chinese civilization.
Okay, great. What two values played a key role in the development of Chinese situation? Who is listening? Yes.
Ability to control floodwaters and
Ability to control floodwaters and
develop irrigation systems, right, for farming? Or
Duty.
is that not right?
duty and controlling the waters. So irrigation was important. Where did the Chinese civilizations first come up? You know this from
The Hong,
the Wang He and
the
the Yangs. Okay, the Wang He and the Yangs were the rivers where early civilizations developed. Are those rivers cooperative and easy to deal with? No, they flood, they go, sometimes change their course in places. So the ability to manage the power of a river and build irrigation systems had to be highly valued because they needed to harness it to grow food and to live there. And so that was important, but also a great base to the Chinese culture, and one that I really admire, is a sense of duty. A sense of duty. Some cultures have lost that completely, but I think a sense of duty is a beautiful thing for a culture to have. That you would do something for your community because you think it's your duty, because you're capable, no one else is doing it, you know you can handle it, and you do it as a sense of duty. To be honorable in your family as a sense of duty. All those things are so beautiful, and duty is a big key word in the major religions of China or philosophies. Now it talks about the geography, and the interesting thing about the geography of China is it's surrounded on several sides. There are natural barriers. I don't know if that was in this section, was it?
Yeah,
Okay, so who can tell me what the natural barriers are? Yes.
the Tian Shan and the Himalayas, and then also like Mount Everest kind of.
Okay, so mountains is one of them. What's another one?
Deserts?
Deserts is another. What's another? Jungles. Great. And what's the fourth one?
That's
Yes.
probably wrong, but is it ocean?
Yes, it's the ocean. So here you have this inaccessible area. It's either got mountains or thick jungle or a desert you have to cross or an ocean you have to cross. So we can see how later in 1433 when China decided to isolate itself, it was pretty easy to do that. It wasn't easily accessible. It's funny because Alice lives with me and she's from a city north of Beijing. And she said to me the other day, it's so funny to hear you Americans talking about how many of you like to say, well, I've got French and German, and how many of you know some of the races that your family's made of? How many of you know that? You know what kind of, see? China, she says, in China, we're just all Chinese, you know? She just laughs at that because if someone asks her what her background is, she says, it's Chinese, you know, because we're just all Chinese. And yet we're in a melting pot, but China was isolated enough in its development that Chinese people can still say today, we're just Chinese. I think that's rather interesting, and these natural barriers contributed to that. But despite these formidable barriers, China had contact with the rest of the world. It says here that more often, though, the outsiders whom the Chinese encountered were nomadic invaders. To the Chinese, these nomads were barbarians. They weren't highly cultured, they didn't speak Chinese, they liked to fight, they didn't seem civilized to the Chinese. And the Chinese had had, 1,000 years to develop a civilization. The other thing that brought people was trade, and they would come to the coast of China. And you'll be hearing some stories in later chapters. One of them is hilarious about a British guy who comes to trade with the Chinese. And the emperor, yeah, it's a really great story. We'll save it for later. But he brings all these trinkets like he would take to natives in Africa. And he thinks that this king is going to be so amazed, but it was just childish, stupid trinkets to them. And so they really missed their mark there. But we'll talk about that at another time. But we know that the valleys of the Huanghe, the Yellow River, or the Yangtze are surrounding the first civilizations of China. Now, one thing we learned in this section about the Huanghe is that it is a real problem child. It really does need to be harnessed. What does it do all the time that causes problems? What does this river do? Yes? It floods. Look on page 61 and look at these little squares. I'll read the top part and then I'm going to call on some of you to read the other parts. It says, for at least 4,000 years, farmers living along the Huanghe in China have depended on the fertile yellow loess soil deposited along the river's banks. But they have also feared the devastating floods that the river brings every third or fourth year. In 2297 BC, the Huanghe burst its banks, destroying fields and drowning villagers. So, who can read that first square at the top, Maddie?
After days of severe rains, the Huanghe began to overflow its banks, spilling into the
Millet fields. Mm-hmm.
Without the technology to dam the breach, the villagers could only flee or watch in horror as their crops and homes became completely submerged in the swirling, muddy yellow water.
Now, look at this artist's conception of this. What has he done here to save some of the people?
Hold on to his brain.
Okay, some of them are up a tree, and you just want to hope that tree doesn't get knocked over by the flood. Some of them have run up to a little bit higher ground, and you see in the middle, on the left, two people climbing up on a higher hill to escape these flood waters. Now, this is what we saw pictures of just in the last couple weeks in Puerto Rico. We saw pictures of people's streets turned into rivers, rushing rivers. And it was even more complicated in modern times because of the great population, and Puerto Rico's a poor country. So their plumbing systems and electrical systems were already just hanging on by a thread. The flood filled all the sewage systems, brought raw sewage up. These rivers were running with oil and debris and raw sewage. And, you know, there were some people, there was a little gal there with her camera who took pictures and talked about it for the New York Times. And it was so interesting to see these people having to crawl up to the roofs of their houses and just hope the water didn't rise too high. It was very similar. But this one, they had fewer people, and they didn't have as much sewage. I'm sure they probably buried their sewage and it wasn't as extensive, but they also didn't have warnings, and we knew days ahead of time that the hurricane was coming. They had no warnings about these floods, and so many of them would die. Okay, who can read the second square for me? Yes.
No one knows exactly how many people perished in this great flood. Worse yet, after the waters receded, many more people died as a result of great famine that spread throughout the region. Despite the catastrophe, many villagers returned to the same spot to rebuild and plant, taking advantage of the fertile soil deposited by the flood waters.
Thank you, Rachel. So let's bring this one home again. It says more people died after the event. It says there was famine. Why would there be famine after this flood?
Because it destroys all that food.
Okay, it destroyed the crops. And when people are hungry and their immune system goes down, what's another big danger?
Sickness.
Disease, plague. They say that the worst is yet to come for Puerto Rico. The hurricane is past, but the island is contaminated with sewage. The electricity isn't working. There's no clean water running out of a tap for you to drink. There's no toilets to flush. So what would be a likely result of all that?
Disease.
Disease is kind of scary. And, you know, plagues still happen. And that would be just the right settings for it. So we need to remember those people in our thoughts and prayers. Okay, what's the third one? Yes, nice and loud, please.
The villagers' huts were quickly swept away in the flood. Unable to escape their pens, domestic animals reacted in fear as the waters surged towards them.
That's really sad, isn't it? Yeah, that's heartbreaking. Those animals were trapped and had to drown. But when people are running for their lives, they don't have time to get anything else, and so that's what happened. So the Wanghu was a little problem child, and you can see why they would make a hero be able to manage the power of a river. That's pretty exciting. It's nicknamed the River of Sorrows. Now, for tomorrow, I want you to have a clear understanding of the Shang dynasty and then the Zhou dynasty. It's on page 62 and 63. I want you to know which one came first, what their qualities were, what they did, what they contributed, and you're going to be quizzed on that. So you really need to do that. I've kind of gone over the first part that you're going to read with you, but
You have to do what?
pay close attention to the Shang dynasty, S-H-A-N-G, and the Zhou dynasty, Z-H-O-U, on pages 62 and 63. Make sure you understand both of them and what they contributed. And if you're doing notes, write Shang dynasty and write its attributes, and then do the same with the other. The other thing you want to understand is their dynastic cycle. That's on page 64. What is the dynastic cycle? You need to be able to answer that for me at our next class. You guys meet tomorrow, right? Yeah, you've already had your...
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, okay. And so I'll see you tomorrow, even though it's a late start date. And also understand the feudal system. We're going to be learning more about the feudal system. Basically, let me tell you how the feudal system started. In Europe, for example, people lived in different villages all over the place, and guys who were knights or criminals, they'd ride through the village, they'd steal the women, they'd burn the houses. These poor villagers had no protection from robbers and criminals. And so a lord who had land would say to them, if you come work on my land as my serfs, if anybody comes, if we have a war, you may come into the castle keep for protection, and my army will protect you. And then each of those little villages where the serfs worked, they each had different jobs. One was by a stream, so he'd grind grain. Someone would grow wheat. They had protection in time of trouble. They weren't allowed to leave the land. They had to work every day or pay to get a day off if they wanted to get married or something. And so the feudal system started out as being an early form of the police department. They had no police. If someone came and stole your daughter out of your house, there was nothing you could do about it. It must have been horrifying, just horrifying. And then they just put a torch to your house. So this was kind of, and the people consented to this, to work the land in return for protection. That's part of what made the feudal system evolve. You read about the Chinese feudal state and see what you think. And I believe that all you have to read for tomorrow is section 3. Am I right?
Yeah, there's not a section 4.
Oh, okay, then that's definitely it. So section 3. And there's a lot in this. So I would advise doing reading notes, and I will see you at your next class.